thanks. My name is Gary Schwartz, and I'm the director of the Communications and Middleware Group at .cio. And Professor Krishnamurthy invited me to speak on open source at .cio. And I will do that, and I'll meander a little bit about open source in some other ways. I come to the open source thing from essentially three perspectives. One is, originally, like everybody else, we just deployed various open source programs. Also, we wound up as open source developers ourselves developing the beadwork calendaring system. And I also serve on the board of an open source foundation that is JASIG, which does uPortal, beadwork as a project, central authentication server, CAS, as well as some others. And JASIG is merging with Sakai, which does the Sakai LMS open source system. So I'm on the board of JASIG. So I come in from those different perspectives. In .cio, we have a number of different units. We have academic and research computing, which does a little bit in the open source thing that is deploying it. Multimedia services, which I don't really know that much about with respect to open source. Information technology infrastructure, which does a networking, some open source there on some of their networking things, especially in network monitoring. Integrated administrative computing services, not that much in open source. My group, communications and middleware, probably more than anybody else, and the Rinser libraries also do some things with open source, that is especially with deployment. The current environment at RPI I would characterize, that is at a general level, as a culture is pragmatic, not dogmatic, and that open source is fine for infrastructure. It's okay for some academic things, but for administrative computing, not quite there, and probably not heading that way in a big way anytime soon. I would say it's a conservative culture, and interestingly enough, very conservative about administration, but when you think about all the almost everything rides on your infrastructure, how could open source be okay for your infrastructure, but not the things that ride on top of it? But I can appreciate that perspective in some ways. Also, with respect to administration at RPI, technology commercialization has finally recognized software development as under their umbrella, which is kind of good news and bad news in a number of different ways. And it also extends down to the student level, and there are licensing and other obligations with respect to software development as an RPI student and under the RPI umbrella, so you should check that out. Agree or disagree with the policy, you should be cognizant of it. Let's see where I am here. So with respect to what we deploy at .cio, what used to be called LAMP, which is, I guess, which I would now just call the general collection of standard infrastructure stuff that everybody uses. A lot of Linux on the server side, a lot of Apache and other similar things. On the database side, MySQL, Postgres, Perl, PHP, Java, which is not strictly speaking open source, and we've gotten heavily into Drupal and WordPress, just like everybody else in the world. So a lot of the infrastructure is that way, most of the things that my group do are built more or less out of these components. I originally got into that not so much from a philosophical perspective as it gave me budget immunity, is that use things that don't have any licensing fees, deploy it how you want, when you want. Who do you have to talk to? Nobody. Where do you have to get money from? It's outside of hardware, nowhere. And you don't have to worry about things that really had very favorable licensing terms becoming unfavorable, and all of a sudden you've got a problem you can't solve. So my approach originally was pragmatic. The library does actually a fair number of things, many of which are library specific. Most of these things like libstat, my library, and Archon are pretty much library specific things, and they have some other things as well. So the library pretty much gets it also. We also at .cio have been doing a fair amount, quote, a reasonable amount of open source development. The scheduling assistant is an office hours application originally developed at the University of Wisconsin, which really impressed me. They wrote it for themselves, and I encouraged them to re-architect, re-implement it as an open source project, and 2 years later they did that. It's really a dynamite thing, and we helped them with some aspects of that. There's also the ROCS application, which was developed here, which we facilitate in some small way. eSoup is a French open source alliance, very much like JASIG. They have a help desk program, which we'd hoped to roll out here. Didn't quite work out, so we've done some things. We're the first English language deployment of it, even though there are about 40 in France. And we also did some development on that, but that didn't quite work out the way we expected. Concerto, which obviously was developed by people such as yourself or some of the people in this room. And we really haven't done much except for promote that. We were working with the University of Albany. They were interested in beadwork. And while we were selling them beadwork, we said, why don't you buy yourself a concerto as well? And at least at some parts of UAlbany, they're running both beadwork and concerto, and we're looking to do an RCOS presentation on it, but they're so happy with all that. So we promote concerto every chance we get, and it's a natural fit with the calendaring work we do also. And also, the biggest thing we do is beadwork, which really grew out of a collaboration that we had with the University of Washington. They had an open source project, calendaring project. We didn't like their user interface. We were doing a lot of really interesting user interface work, so we said, why don't you let us redo the user interface, you guys do the calendaring thing, and then we'll move on. And after about 1.5 years of working with them, we discovered we're doing all the coding for the project, even though they were making all the decisions. So we decided to take what we learned there, and we came up with beadwork, which is really based on our experience, but it's a completely different set of software. And really what we were looking to do when we first started working with the University of Washington is really what we're looking to do today. We use a ton of open source. We were looking to contribute back, because if nobody contributes back, where do you get it from? So we were looking to contribute in a small way, and then when we discovered when we started developing beadwork, it resonated with the world in a slightly larger way. So beadwork is deployed probably in over 100 places, mostly in North America and Europe, and probably some in Asia as well. There are commercial implementations which are built on top of beadwork. So the goal really was to make a lasting contribution, and beadwork has allowed us to do that. If we could find another project we did which resonated the same way, we would do that. But right now, this is something that people seem to like, strong adoption, and we're delighted to do it. And it's really introduced us to people from throughout the world, giving us enormous second-order opportunities we would not have had we not done this project. So this has really been great. We also contribute to some of the things that beadwork has built at top. iCal4j is an open source library which comes out of Australia. We contribute to that and some other components as well. And I would guess, and this is just a guess, that there are a number of things that the Tetherless world does that perhaps are open source, but I'm guessing. I really don't know for sure. Open source in higher education, I know a little bit about this. I'm on the board of JASIG, which does beadwork, CAS, uPortal, uMobile, and I'll talk a little bit about that, scheduling assistant, and also the student success plan, which comes out of a community college in the Midwest. Again, developed locally for their own needs, and they saw the light and re-architected it as an open source project, which if you can imagine starting one way and doing it another, it's a lot of work, especially if you don't write with open source in mind. It's a dynamite project. Sakai I talked about, which is merging with JASIG. It's an LMS, probably the leading open source LMS, similar to conceptually to Blackboard, really. Koali, which has done enterprise higher ed software similar to Banner and some other things as well, including OLE, which is the Open Library Initiative, and Koali Mobility, and I'll circle back to that, DuraSpace, which is DSpace for Dura Commons and DuraCloud, heavily used in the repository library world and some other things. OpenCast, Vivo, which is a very interesting faculty researcher profile system, which is a semantic web application. Probably the most successful one I know of. Really, really interesting stuff. We thought about doing that here, but it's a pretty big lift from where we are. Internet 2 middleware, Shibboleth, Grouper, co-manage, and a bunch of other IDM things. So a lot of really good stuff coming there. uMobile and Koali Mobility. In higher ed, we are starting to see open source frameworks. uMobile is based on uPortal, and we're looking at that now. Koali Mobility out of the Koali project. UCLA has their own mobile framework, and probably about 3 or 4 more. So these are relatively recent open source projects which are just getting off the ground, and where they're especially interesting for higher ed is integrating with the higher ed infrastructure, your authentication space, your student system, your various other system of record, uPortal, which is largely deployed, widely deployed in higher ed. So it's a great fit. We're looking at that. We've done some other things, largely on HTML. We've used some other frameworks, but we're converging on probably going with UMobile for our development because it fits so well with what we're doing here. And I think there are other opportunities. And I think we'll see a fair amount of that in higher ed, moving to one of these frameworks. UCLA is very big in the UC system. Here's a surprise. Not so much other places. So I think there are some opportunities there as well as to get involved with that. Open source issues. When I first started in computing, there really was no open source. Now there is, and when that started, open source has really transformed. The things we do are really largely in community source, which are open source projects with community governance, usually with a foundation home, as opposed to single person, 2 guys in a garage, 2 guys in a something else project. With the rise of mobile devices, smartphones, there are enormous opportunities for one person or a small team of people to monetize what they've done. And I think this is in some ways, actually it's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with money, nothing wrong with monetizing, and nothing wrong with sharing an application widely that people like. But in some respects, I think it undercuts some of the things, certainly in community source. It's another vector. And it's really got none of the overhead of collaborating with large groups of people. On the licensing front, when we first got into the open source business, the University of Washington had an Apache-like, actually it was a BSD-like license, which had almost no restrictions. And we didn't like the idea of, when we first started, of people commercializing our work. And we talked with Washington, and they said, they explained why they did that, but we came to realize that an unrestricted license is really the greatest driver of adoption. And really that's what we're looking to do, is spread our work as widely as possible. And we also realized that unrestricted licenses allow people to repurpose your work in another project, another program. Today, the proliferation of licenses, especially GPL and a bunch of others, makes it really hard for us to redistribute that work. And to do exactly what we'd like to do is build the pieces that we're interested in, build the pieces we have expertise in, and reuse other people's work. And eventually we came around to the least restrictive license is what we wanted. JASIG has an Apache 2 license, which pretty much meets our needs, and we were pretty much there anyhow. And no licensing fees allowed for unrestricted deployment, which is really where we started. We also came to appreciate in open source, especially for Foundation Home, who owns the intellectual property that has the source code, the ideas, trumps the source code availability. That is one of the reasons we found a Foundation Home for our project, is we wanted it to not be an RPI project. We didn't want a change in RPI administration to change the availability of what we've done. And we wanted higher ed to feel comfortable that RPI didn't drive the bus. So the intellectual property for beadwork and the other JASIG projects and the Sakai projects are owned by the Foundation, which provides a permanent stewardship for that. And so what we really like is higher ed really owns the intellectual property associated with a project and a product we really designed for and by higher ed. So I think that's also a great thing. So there are a number of Foundation Homes. And there are some other things which, like the Apache Foundation, which doesn't have corporate or members, but they're individual members. Things like JASIG, Koali have institutional members, largely in higher ed and higher ed partners. This is a cartoon I saw a long, long time ago, which is perhaps my favorite computing cartoon, which simply says at the bottom, I know this may be an awkward time, but do you ever recall and mention the source code? And before there was open source, there was still source code. And there were things we could buy a source code license. But one of the nice things about Foundation Homes and other true open source projects is the source code is always available, theoretically so. where this was a problem back in the day for all of us. Something I saw recently in CNET News, which is, I said, you can read the headline, forget about LinkedIn, companies turn to GitHub to find tech talent. This is both surprising and not surprising all at the same time. LinkedIn is more of an older person's thing. GitHub is more of a younger person's thing. But and this really says to it is it's really more interesting to take a look at somebody's work than to look at their resume. And GitHub, open source, great way to do that. So like I said, both surprising and unsurprising all at the same time. And it shows a maturation of the open source market, the open source infrastructure as well. It's a good thing. Opportunities in open source. Something that's a little more difficult, I think, for people your age and for where you are in your lives are community source projects such as ours, such as beadwork, whatever it is. Your contribution is different. It kind of gets mushed up with everybody else's. And I think most of you are really looking right now to more architect drive the bus rather than help move the bus forward in another way. So it's something to think about, and it's also a nice way to make a contribution. And even as you do what you're doing, if you can find a community source foundation project that you're interested in, it's a nice way to make a contribution. And also to meet a lot of smart people who are doing some really nice work. When you do open source, think about repurpose and reuse. These things are great to think about. They're really, really, really hard to do in practice. And there are a handful of things that really do that. But if you can do that, that's really a winner. One of the things that we learned through our project is a project is more than just a repository. There's a whole bunch of other things that come along with leading a successful project. And the question for everybody is, what are you willing to do to be successful? We really were software developers, and we had a project, and then once it started becoming interesting, we discovered the overhead of running a project was a little different than we anticipated. And we also discovered that that having a successful project is more than just having a good product. It's leadership, it's marketing, it's a whole bunch of other things. So to the extent you're successful, it's important to understand what are you wanting to be successful, what are you good at, and what other elements do you need to bring in? What are your success metrics if you're really looking to do that? And I also think, actually another thing that's an opportunity, and I'm not sure where it's going, software-defined networking, something that's relatively new, whereas we're really looking at a potential sea change in networking hardware and software, and where the line between those things are. Highly complex field, highly technical field, but it's an opportunity that really seems to be emerging. Internet 2 is really embracing it, and the vendors in various ways, so that's something to think about also. If you've got the network chops, this is something that didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago and is really, really interesting. And the other thing I would leave you with is I think that RCOS is absolutely a dynamite thing. I think the Professor Morthy's dedication, mentoring, and his stewardship of both of the program and of the students that have gone through it is really exemplary and inspiring, really, too. I think the things that have come out of RCOS are probably all over the place in terms of quality and utility, but there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of interesting stuff, and if the first project doesn't get it, as long as it leads to the second and third project, how good is that? All really good stuff. So I encourage you to give yourselves a pat on the back, as well as Professor Morthy, as this is really a very special thing that's going on here. And I think it's a great boon to Rensselaer. And the other thing that occurs to me also is that with some of the things like Raspberry Pi and some of the very small form factor controllers, semi-controller computers, really a lot of nice opportunities, as well as perhaps an opportunity to partner with people on the EE and computer engineering side of the house to do something really special that 5 years ago was probably not really that possible too. So think about those opportunities as well. That really kind of takes all this stuff to the next level. So with that, I'll stop talking. Questions, comments, thoughts? Almost all of us in the VCC are delighted to talk to any of you about anything. If there's a project we can help with, if you're interested in what we're doing, delighted to do it. This is really good stuff. So kudos to all of you. full stop.